Hi, wonderful freshmen. We're winding down our Unit 4 unit for the honors classes. So, couple last standards for you guys. This one is Standard 7, which is to analyze the motives for and methods by which European nations, Japan, and the US expanded their imperialistic practices in Africa and Asia during this era, and evaluate the impact of these actions on their relations. So we're going to focus on Japan for this video because we really already focused on Europe and the United States. And we're going to concentrate more on the reasons for their imperialistic practices, sort of show how it connected to the Industrial Revolution, which is the same for what we did for other regions. So it's important to compare and contrast Japanese imperialism with Western imperialism. Some features were similar and some were drastically different. Okay, so the government and social structure in Japan was vastly different than Western imperialist nations. And like Western nations, feudalism was developed there, right? However, there's a big difference. Whereas we saw the European feudalism transition over centuries throughout the Middle Ages and afterwards. Japanese feudalism transitioned out in just a couple of decades, really after the 1968 Meiji Restoration, which really is after the Western Industrial Revolution was already well underway. So another difference is the idea of laissez faire in government and in business. Remember with the Western countries, we discussed how governments were like hands off. You guys sort of do what you do and make your money and we're going to prosper. Whereas in Japan, the state was involved all throughout. They had all these little monopolistic enterprises and they were involved with developments for this. And the government used all that was going on there to help further its economic and political goals. So it was in lockstep with the development. Okay, we also want to consider the agricultural features. This is now early 1900s. Okay, so this was a land of small farms, and most of them were managed by tenants or semi-tenant farmers, they were called. The tenants were the bottom of the social and economic ladder. At the top were the landowners, and there were about 1 million of these landowners in 1934. Half of all landowners owned just 9% of the cultivated land. And the rent on the tenants was very high. It was about half their harvest just to pay for that rent. Think about the causes of the French Revolution that we discussed. There's a lot of similarities here. Because of the situation, they had little use for improved technology. So they were still really using basic human power, really. And the living standard was very low at this time. Okay, now you have a development of the military. These are army officers in Japan in the 1930s. In Japan, it was contemporary military service. So all these males had to serve even in peacetime. The military policy was really shaped by economic and industrial considerations. That's true many times for Western nations, but here I guess it's a bit more obvious perhaps. The idea was that if Japan could not become a major power, she would be threatened like those who were imperialized. Think of British India at the time. So they sort of knew if we don't want to become a colony, we need to step up our military. They did not want to lose political sovereignty. They wanted to remain an independent nation. So how does the military connect to industrialization? Here you see a postcard of the Japanese Navy in the 1930s. Looks extremely Western, right? So what do you need to create and maintain these armed forces, the Army and the Navy? Well, you need heavy industries. You need engineering. You need mining. You need shipbuilding. Basically, you need to be an industrialized nation. So the first stage of Japan's industrialization was mixed with these military concerns. And in the 1860s and 1870s, however, Japan was no more industrialized than British India. We're going to look at some numbers in a second. So they had a lot of catching up to do, and basically they did it. And this foundation for industrialization developed in World War I. So you see a huge difference in Japan between World War I and World War II, which we'll see in the fourth marking period. Okay. Imports and industrialization. So that sort of reflects how industrialized a nation is. By 1913, two-thirds of its imports were raw materials and half finished products, where finished goods were only 17% of its imports. Now compare that with India. Okay, so in India, raw materials and unfinished goods were less than 6%, and finished goods were about 80%. So by World War I, Japan's trade resembled older industrial nations already, but it was still lagging behind. It was still nowhere near Britain or Germany or the United States. By 1928, they were 2.4% of the world's industrial production, so it shows that they were stepping up their game. However, look at how much they're still lagging behind. France was 7%, Great Britain was 9%, Germany was over 11%, and the US was almost 45%. So how does this change? Okay, so in 1929 in Japan, over half of all the workers in factories that had more than 5 employees was in textiles. Remember, that's a theme we've seen in the Industrial Revolution. It starts in the textile industry. But they were still behind in machine production, and we know how essential machines are to industrialize. By 1929, only 10% of its industrial production was in machines. So you see the image on the right. That's an image of when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. This is a game changer. So now you see the connections between needing to imperialize in order to industrialize, and then to sort of keep that cycle going. So the number of textile workers after this increased by over 200,000, and just like, I mean in a short period, not like decades, and the factories by over 7,000. And you have a huge upswing in essential industrial markets, metals, machineries, and tools, chemicals. In 1931, only 22% of all of its workers were in these industries. A few years later, it was twice as high as all the other industrial workers. So it shows you how the start of imperialism changes all that. Okay. Led to more changes, but it still has obstacles. By 1937, the exports of machinery surpassed its imports. That's good, right? You want to export more than you're importing. So it was exporting 370 million yen in machinery, importing 288 million yen in machinery. Most of the machinery imports did come from other industrialized nations, the United States, Germany, and England. So in 1938, machinery production in Japan was 9 times more than it was just a few years earlier in 1931. That is rapid change. And remember what we discussed about like what happens with all this rapid change. Now here's the issue. If it wants to keep industrializing, right, it wants to keep going, but it needs more raw materials, right? Look at Japan. It's an archipelago. It's a couple of islands, right? Where is all this stuff going to come from? They don't have enough for steel production, for oil, for cotton, for wool, for rubber. Deficits, right? It needs to get that someplace else. So by this point, it imported more than 4/5 of its iron ore and more than 9/10 of its oil, right? That makes an important difference. Also, you need to still take care of your people and feeding them, and they were not self-sufficient. They needed to bring in food, right? Even with all those farms, there was a big sugar deficiency, and we know how humans became addicted to sugar. There's also a bit of a rice deficiency. That's even though most of its farms, or I should say many of its farms, were in rice production, it still wasn't enough to feed its population. So here's the result. It needed to become a military power on the level of other nations. It needed to supply for all the materials it lacked. It needed to build up a complementary economy to make this happen. But to do this, conquest was required, which means it had to become imperialist. Japan had a favorable geographic position for imperialism. You see the map here, the areas it imperialized. However, think of where the other imperial nations were, right? It was not going to be competing with other imperial nations. They were too far away. The closest one was Russia. They weren't involved. They had this theme of World War II as Asia for the Asiatics. In other words, we'll imperialize this area. Everyone else, you white folks imperializing other places, you go imperialize over there. So they imperialized in Formosa, Korea, Manchuria, and China. We'll learn more about that when we do the World War II unit, but hopefully you understand the connection between the Industrial Revolution and imperialism in Japan, and also some of the similarities and differences to the other nations we talked about. If you have any questions, please ask, and I look forward to talking to you about this next class. All right. Enjoy some break if that's what you're doing right now.